Good afternoon. I didn't want to make this video, but I think it's entirely necessary because I found a video online that questions the authenticity of such a revered saint as Paul of Tarsus. And to think that such a video would make these absurd claims that Paul was never actually a follower of Jesus and he taught a different faith than that of Jesus Christ. It is a slap in the face to 2,000 years of Christianity, all because I said so. And though there are reasons brought forth in the video, of course, gonna link that. I might even play some clips during this one. But the theory relies on one fundamental tactic, right? And it's dividing Jesus from the apostles. He does this so often. And he says, well, you know what? Basically, you know what? Paul taught this other thing and Jesus taught this thing. But we're totally forgetting about all the other apostles, for that matter. And not to mention, I think, just apostolic Christianity in general. Right, we're throwing it out the window. Well, he does address it, and I'll mention that later in this. So I think first and foremost, what is the theory? Right, it's basically saying that Paul is not actually a follower of Jesus because he teaches something radically different, and the reason behind that is because I said so, and Paul's additions are later. So this is just straight up Gnosticism. Straight up, first and foremost, get out of the way. It is Gnosticism. It is Marcionism. It is a liberal Protestantism at its finest. And this is recycled over and over again throughout history. Nothing new under the sun. And it is shameful. Have you no shame? No. Obviously, you know, all his evidence is so cherry picked, right? And it's after the fact, right? It's always after the fact. Anybody that comes now, 2,000 years later, and says, this is how you're supposed to interpret this text, I don't buy it one bit. Just straight up. Why should I? Where's your evidence, actually? In history. I'm not even saying just, you know, in the Bible alone, right? I'm saying, where is this elsewhere in the entirety of history? Nowhere, right? This is not historical reasoning. This is ideology. And it's pretending to be history. And we see this all throughout this video. I sincerely encourage you to watch the video. Otherwise, this response makes no sense. So, anyway, his first claim is that basically Paul influenced everyone else and was able to invent his own version of Christianity. And this is because Paul wrote half the New Testament, basically like 48% of it. And it's similar to how McDonald's, in some ways, as a franchise, was not necessarily the same vision as the original McDonald's owners, right? And perhaps Ray Kroc, you know, he altered it, kind of put his own spin on it, but made it popular. This is entirely non sequitur, right? Because influence does not imply invention. So Paul, he did not become a Christian in isolation. You know, he had gone to Jerusalem and he conferred with the apostles, Peter, James, and John. And this is talked about in Galatians too. Verse here. And so the apostles confirmed that he was preaching the same message. And so if Paul was truly inventing this new faith, I think the apostles would have to be fooled, right? And this is just historically absurd, right? How can the apostles be fooled into thinking this is like, oh, yeah, that's the same faith, yet the guy in the video is claiming like, well, they're teaching two different things. So their average response is like, well, that's just because Paul was lying. It's like, okay, well, apparently we can just take out the entirety of Acts as well, the Acts of the Apostles. And yeah, furthermore, of course, Christianity, this is his second claim. Christianity is not from Jesus, but it's about Jesus. He says this a lot in the first sort of segment of the video. And this is just wordplay, right? This is a fallacy. This is not an argument. This is no argument right here. Because Christ was founded excuse me, because Christ founded the church, right? It talks about this in Matthew 16:18. He commissioned the apostles, talks about it in Matthew 28. And he gave them authority, talks about it in Luke 10. So clearly, Christianity and the church, they're inseparable. And they're both from Jesus and about Jesus. So, number 3, this was his third claim. Paul never quotes Jesus, and he didn't really care or know about his teachings. That's just a lie, right? That's blatantly false, of course, because Paul quotes from him numerous times. 1 Corinthians 7:10, 1 Corinthians 9:14, 1 Timothy 5:18, Acts 20:35, and that's a unique quotation of Christ, by the way. And so to say that he doesn't quote from Christ whatsoever, it's like, I mean, that's absurd. You know, actually, if this were the case, right, Paul could have revised all of his letters later on to add what it says in the Gospels, right? Or actually, furthermore, if we were to suggest that Paul was lying the whole time, right, couldn't the Gospels, which were written later, as we all know, couldn't they have just inserted something from Paul? Does this not add up to some people? I don't think they understand that dilemma. The internal consistency is there, except they just glaze right past it. And whenever they do that, they make this grave error. Because Paul constantly references the core of Jesus' teachings: death, resurrection, and lordship. Right? So, number 4 is that Jesus and Paul contradict each other at multiple times. And that's just a straight misrepresentation of Jesus' teaching. Because the guy is constantly giving his own interpretation of the text. Jesus always taught the necessity of belief for salvation. It says it in John multiple times. John 8:24 and John 3:18, actually. And he came for all nations, not just the Jews. It says it in John 10:16 and Matthew 28:19. And it also says that salvation is through union with him. It says it in John 6:53 through 57. See, Paul's primary audience was the Gentiles, yes. But one must remember that Paul was not just speaking to the Gentiles. He also went to the synagogues before he went to the Gentiles. And it talks about this. Not to mention, he always addresses the Jews. He's constantly addressing the Jews. He's never just solely addressing the Gentiles. He may be the apostle to the Gentiles, but his audience is never strictly the Gentiles. And it's just a narrow view of Paul as well. Number 5. Paul invented the idea that Gentiles didn't need circumcision. And once again, a lie. It's baseless. Because this decision was made at the Council of Jerusalem. And that was presided by James, John, and Peter. And the rest of the apostles, for that matter. Paul, he didn't invent the idea. And it talks about this in Acts, right? It's a blatant lie. Paul merely carried out the apostles' wishes, okay? So, on to point 6, right? Paul cared way too much about the organization of the church. And his hypothesis as to why this is the case is it was done to control people, and because he didn't know Jesus' teachings whatsoever. So this was basically all he had to comment on. That's how you control people. Of course, this assumes that religion is devoid of structures entirely, and hierarchy is just gone, and that religion just needs to be relying on feelings. This is absurdity, right? Jesus did establish hierarchy. He did establish a church. He talks about this in Matthew 16:18 to 19, where Peter is given authority over the church. He says, what? On this rock, I will build this church, right? It's a visible institution. And furthermore, Matthew 18:17. The church is the final court of appeal. John 21:15 to 17. Peter is commanded to shepherd the flock. Who is that? The followers of Christ. And how do you do that? With organization, hierarchy, structure, a church. Furthermore, this is where we start getting into like schizophrenic levels of just history. This is like Charles Manson theology here. Paul was a Roman spy. This requires so much mental gymnastics to arrive at this conclusion, because this would suggest that Paul orchestrated a religion that would undermine Rome's religion for not just, then, but until it was recognized in 325. So just that entire time, it was undermining the pagan gods. Why would we want that to be the case? Only to become the dominant religion? Not to mention, Paul would effectively be worshiping a Jewish executed criminal. That would strike all the Romans as odd. If that were to be the case, if he was some spy, but okay, well, I guess their defense to that would be that, well, he was never actually worshiping him. Well, that would work, except for the fact that he got beheaded. Okay? In 67 AD, for worship of this Jewish executed criminal. This is where you have to really think about this and put on your thinking caps for 5 seconds. Would a spy ever get executed by the same people that sent the spy? No. This is absurdity. And I think this is the biggest leap in this whole line of thinking, is that in order for this to be the case, is that Christianity would undermine the Roman religion, but also Rome would persecute them for 300 years. And this whole thing, it undermines the persecution from Rome for the next 300 years. Pavis Strategius said it was 13 million people. Some of the highest estimates, I think from other people, is 6 to 8 million. Nonetheless, we're looking at well over at least 1 million people being executed for their belief in Christianity. And yet, it was all orchestrated by some guy who was a spy? No. Right? No, this is absurd. This is just, it's mind-boggling how people can just be that stupid to believe such a thing. The core fallacy of all this is that it ignores the rest of Scripture, and they're unfamiliar with ancient Jewish context, and they're unaware of all of early church history. We'll come back to this, right? But the purpose of the whole video is to make Christianity appear incoherent, so then the speaker can introduce his new, real form of Christianity, which just so happens to be his own interpretation of the text. Which is flawed, right? And original. Which is not a good thing whenever it comes to the matters of faith. So, this is not new by any means, right? This is literally Gnostic, and it's heretical. Just plain and simple. This is Gnosticism, right? And though I'm not Roman Catholic, you know what? The reason he undermines Catholics at the end, and he says, oh, well, the Catholic Church doesn't want you to read the Bible, right? Is because he wants to push his own adulterated, ahistorical interpretation that would slander my faith, slander my Lord, and of course be laughed at by all church authorities. And that's why he wants to undermine the church, because it's ahistorical and it's nonsense. That's why. See, okay, here's my recommended readings from this video, okay? And I want you to honestly read all these things and piece together what you can to understand how this works, because it's not nearly as black and white as this guy seems to think. I don't think he understands we have verifiable extra-biblical history we can look at, right? You ever read this thing called First Clement, right? It appeals to Paul's authority, but he's also a disciple of St. Peter. So, the first century church rightfully understood Peter and Paul as authoritative and on the same level. And they're correct. And that Paul was correct on doctrine and practice. The Didache prescribes all kinds of teachings that are uniquely found in Paul's letters and theology. Ignatius of Antioch, he repeatedly talks about church structure, and he quotes the New Testament constantly. And he clearly was part of the early church and accepted Paul. Polycarp, the disciple of John, He constantly cites Pauline theology. And this, because of his connection to John and his quotations from Paul, this confirms that clearly Paul was accepted by the early church. And he was accepted extra-biblically as a genuine apostle. So, these all matter because it shows that there's temporal proximity and acceptance by these other people outside of just a biblical context, right? So you want to say, okay, the Bible's altered, whatever, right? Okay, well, what about all these other texts that are outside of the Bible, right? That have no influence from, these greater, puppeteers, right? No. Clement, Polycarp, Ignatius, all these people, they recognize Paul. And they recognize him as authoritative, just like all the other apostles. And some of them disciples of the other apostles, right? This is practical continuity here. So, bottom line is that Paul's letters were read, applied, and treated as apostolic instruction. And at the end of the 1st and 2nd century, by the apostles and their own disciples. So to claim, he was some kind of late imposter or, a fraud, this is historically baseless. You know what? I want to condemn this individual who made this video because he dares slander my Lord. He slandered St. Paul, and he slanders my faith, my church, everything. He slanders it. And for that, I condemn you.